Hi, welcome back to Videos from the Ville. I'm Dr. Charles Greenawalt, and this is Canadian Government and Politics. In this particular lesson, we want to take a look at the Canadian polity. We want to look at the Canadian state. And we want to look at the characteristics of the Canadian polity. We find that as we look at any polity, what is the nature of government? You find that there are 5 significant variables that are true in discussing the nature of government wherever we may look. And I want to cover those 5 variables with you now. First of all is the ubiquitous nature of government. You find that our polities are ubiquitous both geographically and practically. In terms of practically, you find that whatever we do during the course of a day is generally affected in some way, shape, or form by government. So it's ubiquitous in our lives, and it's impossible to ignore or to try to get away from. You find that all earthly domains are claimed by some nation state, and not only is all the ground in the world claimed by one government or another, but as we said a moment ago, government influences and affects everything that we do in life, directly or indirectly. Well, again, I want to remind you, you should have your PowerPoints by your side, and you can look at those as we go through this lecture. Okay. The second variable to talk about as we look at the nature of government is the multiple nature of government. You find that every citizen is subject to a number of governments and government units. Government is definitely a plural phenomena in Canada and in the United States. Of course, you have in Canada you have the British Empire, the Commonwealth of Nations. As Queen Elizabeth II is the Queen of Canada. But you also then, of course, have the nation of Canada, the provincial government. If you live in Ontario or Quebec or Alberta or Prince Edward Island, and then you have your local government as well. So government is a plural phenomena. You find that as time goes by, government also becomes increasingly complex. The complexity of government increases year by year, decade by decade. And we find that as time has gone by, every governmental level has generated additional units of government. If you want to look at how that would work out in Canada, you find that in Canada we would be subject to what? To the federal government, the federal cabinet, headed by the Prime Minister. You would have 10 provincial cabinets. You would have a national parliament. You have 10 legislative assemblies at the provincial level. We find that one study of local government in metropolitan Toronto that was conducted in the late 1960s discovered that in the Toronto area you had 101 governmental units. 101. And we find that as we look at the nature of government and the multiple nature of government, you find that Schatzschneider is a very famous political scientist. He weighs in on this topic as well. He said that governments are like bees, birds, fish, cattle, or wolves. They come in swarms, they come in flocks, they come in schools, herds, or packs, but they never come alone. You find multiplication of governments has proceeded further in America than in Canada. Canada's larger, but even though Canada's larger, it only has 10 provinces and 3 territories as opposed to 50 different states. Well, we also find the third element is that government, when we look at the nature of government, it's also expansive in nature. We find that the functions of government, the costs of government, and the number of personnel within government are always growing. What are the reasons for the growth? Well, we find that people are demanding and expecting a wider range of services. We find that there's an increase in population. We find that society has become more complicated and more complex. And lastly, it's the nature of bureaucracy itself. Bureaucracy always will seek to expand. This trend is definitely more pronounced and accelerated in the modern era of history, but its tendency to grow is recognized itself as a law of bureaucracy. So we find that there's the expansive nature of government, and the reasons for growth is that people are demanding and expecting a wider range of services. There has always been an increase in population and the nature of bureaucracy itself. Well, the fourth element is the necessary nature of government. And the necessary nature of government is driven home, of course, by Thomas Hobbes. Thomas Hobbes, the author of the famous book, The Leviathan, considers government necessary to avoid a state of nature. A state of nature is a situation in which man's existence is nasty, brutish, and short. Nasty, brutish, and short. We find that without government there will be anarchy, a state of nature in which the biggest, the strongest, the most aggressive individuals, they do whatever they want to do. And if you get in their way, they will probably address the situation by force. So you find government becomes a very, very important mechanism to regulate and to control violence or conflict within society. And of course, this leads us to the question of what causes conflict within society. And we find that certainly conflict will always arise from scarcity, and conflict will always arise from diversity. So if you have a certain element of diversity and scarcity, you will generally have a conflict emerging out of those situations. Lastly, we have the varied nature of government. So number 5 is the varied nature of government. So we look at the nature of government. It's the varied nature of government that we need to also consider. No two governments are exactly alike. Therefore, we have a need to classify governments. On your PowerPoint, you have what are called two essentially democratic republics. You have the United States Congress portrayed, and how it looks in its sessions. And then you have the Canadian House of Commons, which of course is the main decision-making body for the Canadian Parliament and for the nation of Canada. So you have the Canadian House of Commons and you have the U.S. Congress. And I want you to take a look at the two pictures at the bottom of the PowerPoint. You can tell a lot by how a room for any organization is structured, how it's set up, and it does affect its functioning. And we'll talk about that a little bit more when we come to it. Okay? Well, this is just a quick overview on the Canadian polity. So you understand some of the most basic lessons or some of the most basic ideas on how the Canadian state works. Okay? We'll be back right after this with the next lesson from Canadian government politics.